And no, I'm not the guest speaker. Dr. Bass is the assistant professor of Bible at Oklahoma Christian University. He has a bachelor's from Yale, a master's from Vanderbilt, a PhD from St. Louis University. He specializes in the history and theology of the early church in North Africa. Now, as I've said all that, that's pretty impressive, but that's not why he's here today. Tony was supposed to be gone, and we were looking for a speaker, and it's December, so we were struggling a little bit, and Kevin said, let's ask Max, who's one of the elders at Memorial Road, if maybe one of their ministers could come over. And Max said, I have a very nice young man who is a professor at OC who is an outstanding speaker. And that's why Dr. Bass is here with us today. He is married. His wife Candace is not with him. They have 4 children. 2 of them are with them today, Destiny and Dustin. Dylan, excuse me. Sorry, Dylan. I was talking to another gentleman from OC on Friday, and he said, oh, Dr. Bass is outstanding, but his wife is even better. That is why Dr. Bass is speaking today. He's an outstanding man who happens to know a lot about Bible. Our hope is that he will get to know us better, and at some point Kevin will do one of his good introductions and tell you that he is a friend of our congregation here and part of our family. Dr. Bass, we are honored. We hope to see much more of you, and we just really appreciate you coming over and teaching today.
Bill's very kind to say those things before he's actually heard me preach. In Isaiah chapter 40, the prophet speaks a word which continues to be relevant thousands of years later. In Isaiah 40, he says, comfort. Yes, comfort my people, says our God. Speak comfort to Jerusalem and cry out to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned, for she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill brought low. The crooked places shall be made straight, the rough places smooth. The glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. The voice said, cry out. And he said, what shall I cry? All flesh is grass, and all its loveliness is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. In a year of constant upheaval, it's good to hear that there's something that stands forever. Something that doesn't change. Something that we can count on, no matter what else is going on. We are near the end, thank God, of one of the most tumultuous years that many of us recall. It's not the worst year that there's ever been, for sure, but it's been a hard time for many of us. A summer of racial protest, a divisive election season, which seems like it's been 50 years long, and then, of course, the pandemic on top of everything else. For many of us, this has led to inconveniences left and right, at work and at school. For others, it's led to more serious things: fear, panic, a sense of being out of control. And for some of us, of course, it's resulted in grief and loss as we continue to see the death toll rise from the virus. And on top of this is in addition to the things that all of us are struggling with because we're just people. The financial challenges and the relationship issues and the family difficulties and the mental health issues that many of us are suffering, anxieties and depressions. But looking back on 2020, one thing we can say is at least we have not been conquered by a foreign power and taken into captivity. And that's more than the people of God could say when this prophecy was made. In the year 587, King Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Babylons, sent in his troops, conquered Jerusalem after several failed attempts. He destroyed the city, tore down the massive ancient walls, and then most devastatingly of all, he went to the Temple Mount and he razed it to the ground. And then after that, he took all of the best of the people and he sent them on a long march east to live in Babylon. And for Israel, it was the most traumatic moment in their history and remains in the memory of the Jewish people right there next to the Holocaust as the most traumatic moment in their history. Even after a year like 2020, it's hard for us to understand what an event like this does to a group of people. Fortunately, the Bible captures just a little bit of the moment in Lamentations. Lamentations is a long poem that was written by someone in the immediate aftermath of this tragedy. And I just want to read you a few verses to give context to Isaiah's prophecy from Lamentations 1. And you're going to hear a word come up again and again. In Lamentations 1:2, the writer says, bitterly she weeps at night. This is Jerusalem personified. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, there is no one to comfort her. And in verse 9, her filthiness clung to her skirts. She did not consider her future. Her fall was astounding. There was none to comfort her. And in verse 16, this is why I weep and my eyes overflow with tears. No one is near to comfort me. No one to restore my spirit. My children are destitute because the enemy has prevailed. Zion stretches out her hands, but there is no one to comfort her. And then in verse 21, people have heard my groaning, but there is no one to comfort me. In 587, Israel could see no comfort, no consolation. And so what good news it must have been years later to hear these words from the prophet, from God, comfort, yes, comfort my people. God is a God of comfort. Even though in those moments of difficulty and pain and trauma, it's easy to forget that, to overlook it. Comfort is one of the primary things people seek in religion. It's something they look for. It's not all that there is, but it's what they look for. And it's not wrong. Paul described God in this way. In 2 Corinthians 1, he says, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. 4 times that word comfort comes up in these 2 verses in 2 Corinthians. But the comfort that Paul's talking about and the comfort that Isaiah foresees is something more than simply personal consolation. It's more than a pat on the back. It's more than a nice card that says everything's going to be okay. Because if you go back to Isaiah 40, this is the reason Israel is comforted. Because warfare is ended. Because iniquity is pardoned. The comfort comes not in this emotional feeling of everything's going to be okay, whether it really is or not. The comfort comes because what the prophet is saying is God is in fact making everything okay. God is not just making you feel better, God is working in the world. And he's doing tremendous things beyond what any of us can do, such as bringing an end to warfare. Inconceivable for us, and yet this is what the prophet is saying is around the corner. And this pardon of iniquities, again, something bigger than any of us. And it's not just my personal sins that are being pardoned, but this is the sin of the people. This is Israel's iniquities. If we think back to our struggles as a nation this summer, the racial protest, the original sin of the American people, slavery, that's the level of pardon we're talking about. And part of the reason this is so difficult is because we don't exactly know what to do with guilt and who's responsible and who's guilty. And it's very difficult and confusing for us. It would have been for Israel too. Who's responsible for us being in captivity? I didn't do anything wrong. Your grandparents did. And now you're paying a consequence for it. The prophet doesn't take the time to sort out all of the details. He simply says, God has pardoned you. There's freedom from iniquity. And the form that it takes here in Isaiah 40 is of a policy declaration. It's odd language. We expect religious language, pardon and guilt and so on. But God here is speaking as the judge who had sentenced them to exile for their sin, and who now says, you've paid the penalty. You are pardoned. And what does that mean? Well, it's like being let out of prison. Your pardon means you can go home. Pardon is what was necessary for homecoming. And so consolation or comfort, again, not just personal, it is a divine verdict for all the people. Which is why the very next couple of verses say, make straight in the desert a highway, because you're going home. You're going home after the suffering. You're going home after the judgment. You're going home. And we're sweeping off the road, and we're washing the sheets and getting your room ready for you again. Because the exile's over. That which prevented you from coming home before is resolved. Now, again, we don't have to stretch our minds too much, even though this was a long time ago and it's working at a national level. How many of us at the holidays, this one, of course, being an exception, have an empty chair, have unresolved issues? How many of us can't go home? Or have family members that feel like they can't come home because of one reason or another? It's not so different from what God is talking about here. There is a reason that you couldn't come home, but now that is resolved. And you can come and sit at the table again. Just a few chapters earlier, in chapter 35, this highway language is a theme in Isaiah. It comes up a lot. It's a theme in Jesus' ministry too. But in Isaiah 35, verse 8, this is what he says about that highway. A highway will be there It will be called the way of holiness. It will be for those who walk on that way. The unclean will not journey on it. The wicked fools will not go about on it. No lion will be there, nor any ravenous beast. They will not be found there, but only the redeemed will walk there. And those the Lord has rescued will return. They will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them. Sorrow and sighing will flee. There's the comfort and consolation again. But it comes because we're able to go home. Because our relationship has been reconciled. Because there's resolution now. It's no accident that these are the very words that John the Baptist used when he was trying to communicate to people who Jesus was. Prepare the way of the Lord. He's out in the desert. He's preaching the highway, the way of holiness. And he says that somehow it's connected to this guy, Jesus, who's showing us the way home. So this is good news, this message of comfort and consolation, this message of homecoming. It's the gospel. But the prophet has his doubts. That's what comes up in these next few verses. The voice says, cry out, preach, proclaim the good news. But the prophet says, what shall I cry? All flesh is as grass, and its loveliness like the flower of the field. In other words, why should I waste my breath on these people? They're faithless. They don't care. They wither like the grass. They're not going to listen, even if it's good news for them. And what does the voice respond? The word of the Lord stands forever. In other words, our resistance, our apathy, our refusal to be comforted, our refusal to receive the consolation doesn't change a thing, because God's word continues to be at work, because the good news continues to be the good news, because God is still operating to bring an end to warfare and to pardon iniquities. It's not God who needs to change here. It's me who has to open up to receive what's being given. So no matter our own attitude, no matter the attitude of our people or this particular moment in history, the word of the Lord stands forever, and it continues to work. And so what is the Lord's word? What's the message that he gives? It's in verse 9. It's a very simple message. Although I think if we ask each other, hey, what's the gospel, what's the good news, this may not be the way that we would say it, at least the first time around. The gospel is this: here is your God. Here is your God. Behold your God. God is here. Why do you have to get a voice from heaven to tell you that? Shouldn't the people of God know this? Isn't it obvious that God is here? Well, I don't think it was obvious. It wasn't obvious then. I don't think it's really that obvious now. Remember the situation of the people of Israel at the time. God, their God, Yahweh, oh, thank you, Tony. Thank you much. Had just been defeated in a great battle. His temple was destroyed. And in the ancient world, if your temple's destroyed, that must mean you're not a very strong God. You can't really defend yourself. Why would you let these other, non-gods run over you? And certainly, the Babylonians would have thought, our God won. Our God, God's name was Marduk. Marduk is the stronger God. How do you know that? Well, obviously we've taken over the world. Our God must be the best. And so here's Israel after 3 generations or so of captivity, and they're living in Babylon. They're living under the shadow of the temple of Marduk, the god who seems to have beaten their God. And they're eating Babylonian food, and they're listening to Babylonian music, and their kids are in Babylonian schools. And it's Marduk, Marduk, Marduk. And what do you think the temptation would be after several generations in that environment? Maybe Marduk is the real God. Maybe my grandparents were wrong in thinking about that Yahweh who's now so far away in the ruins of the crumbled up temple. I don't know why I'm hanging on to that old stuff. Marduk is clearly, even if Yahweh's real, Marduk is clearly the stronger one, the more powerful one. And who do I want on my side in the pandemic when the enemies are at the gates? I want the strong God. I want Marduk. And if you want to make the case, and I don't know how you're going to do it, but if you want to make the case that no, Yahweh, the God of Israel, is strong, well, then you have to answer the next question. Well, then why doesn't he care about us? Why does he let us get run over? Why does he let us get taken away? Why does he let us get sick with a pandemic? If he's strong enough to do anything, he must not care enough to do anything. It wouldn't have been obvious to people then that God was there. And I don't think it's always obvious to us, even God-fearing people like us, that God is still here. What gods tempt us now? Who do we look to for salvation in this moment? Well, we're certainly hoping the doctors come through with something. Medical technology. We, put some faith in strong financial markets. A lot of us are watching the ticker at the bottom of the screen. We've got a lot riding on that. Some of us, it's the right political party getting in power. That's going to solve a lot of our problems. That's going to take a load off of me. My anxiety will feel better when all that's resolved the way that I think it should be resolved. And so we end up, even while we sit in church, kind of sharing our allegiance with these other gods, kind of leaning towards where am I really seeking comfort? When the market's doing well, when I get the good news about the vaccine, when the politics go right. In and of themselves, none of these things are wrong or bad. But as soon as they begin to be the source of our comfort and consolation, that means that they have become our gods. That means that's where we see the power in the world, the strength. Just like for Babylon, it was this, or for Israel, it was this Marduk God. This gospel, or this way of formulating the gospel of no, God is here even if God doesn't appear very strong or mighty. This is the gospel of the New Testament as well. It's not just Isaiah. We focus on the cross, and rightly so. The cross is good news of reconciliation, good news of forgiveness of sins, good news that the iniquity has been pardoned. But remember the original good news. It shows up in the New Testament as well, right? Right at the very beginning of the story. What is it that those angels are singing? What is it that Mary and Joseph named their little boy? God is here. God with us. In some sense, that gospel, that word that is unchanging in Isaiah is the word that remains in the New Testament. God is here. In the dark time, when the markets are failing, when the pandemic is raging, when the politics are crazy and a mess, God, that God, is here. And when the world is spinning out of control and it seems like no one is in charge, God is here. And when I'm sick, and when I'm mourning and grieving, and when I'm confused and at a loss to explain things, God is here. And this is a word that stands forever. In fact, if we fast forward to the very end of the New Testament, which is a picture of the very end of all things, at the, Revelation 21, the beautiful connection is the vision that John saw, the new heaven and the new earth. He says in verse 3, "And I heard a loud voice from heaven." There's that voice again, that same voice that Isaiah heard. A loud voice from heaven saying, "Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God, and God shall wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away." What's the gospel at the very end of the book? God is here. Where is our consolation? God is here. The God of all comfort. The God who's at work not just to heal my personal pain, but the God who is at work healing the world. Making all things new. John sees. Isaiah also. Behold, I create a new heavens and a new earth. And this is what he says back in Isaiah 40 in the next two verses. "Behold, the Lord shall come with a strong hand." He may not look powerful. Maybe his temple was destroyed. Maybe the virus is raging and things are out of control. But God is strong, the prophet says. God remains in control. And in verse 11 he says, "And he feeds his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs with his arms. He carries them in his bosom." God's both a mighty warrior, someone to be fearful of. God is also this loving shepherd who cradles the lambs in his arms. Both of these pictures side by side. Yes, God is strong enough. And yes, God does care. God, in the middle of all this mess, is still making the highway, creating that road in the desert, the wilderness that we've been going through in 2020. God has never stopped making that road, making that way home, because God has never left. God is here, and God has always been here. The desert and the parched land will be glad, Isaiah says back in 35. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom. So strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with a fearful heart, "Be strong. Do not fear. Your God will come. He will come to save you." And it's at this time of the year when we remember that, right? It's not that God just shows up with Jesus and all of a sudden God is with us. Jesus is a sign that God had always been here. Just like we read the stories and remember in just a moment the story of Jesus, because God is still here with us. And the life of Jesus, the story of Jesus, it's a sign of who God always is and always has been and always will be. A God who feeds the hungry and heals the broken, who speaks a word of comfort to the grieving, a God who works to bring an end to warfare, a God who pardons our iniquities. And the invitation to us, The invitation to us is to get on the road with him, to join God on that highway. It's already opened up. There's nothing more that we have to do except take the step to join him. And so that's the invitation that we extend this morning. It's the invitation that extends every time that we're together to join God here, to be with God. We do that by trusting him like Israel had to do, by believing that he is who he says he was, that he is powerful and that he does care. By turning back on the old way, turning away from the Marduks in our life and heading towards him, repenting and confessing those past sins, committing ourselves to a new way through baptism. And we also have the opportunity every time we're together to make amends, to ask for forgiveness where we have gone astray and wandered from the path, to come back and to follow our God where he's leading us. So as you go out this week and throughout the season, I pray that the God of comfort brings you comfort so that you may in turn comfort others.